Then we are
bygger.
Kan jag muta min dator? Eller går ljudet ner då på live? Kan jag muta mig när jag är...
Att du kan muta det, absolut. Ja.
Good morning. Warm welcome, everybody, to this breakfast webinar about the life cycle-based chemicals assessment toolbox. My name is Hanna Holmqvist. I work at IVL Swedish Environmental Research Institute, and I lead a work package in Mistra SafeChem on life cycle assessment and management. And I will start this webinar with some introductory words and then leave the word to my colleagues. Presenting today is Dr. Thomas Rydberg, Senior Researcher on Life Cycle Management at IVL, Kerstin von Borries, PhD student with Professor Peter Fandke at the Danish Technical University, and Dr. Jutta Hildenbrand, Senior Researcher in the Life Cycle Assessment at RISE. After the presentations, I hope you have a lot of questions, and I will moderate a discussion. We do have some webinar rules. We ask you to write your questions in the chat, and if you're willing, please state who you are and your organization. If there are needs for clarifications, these will be addressed after each presentation. Other questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. We record this webinar and we will share the recording afterwards. The presentations will not be sent out. But what is Mistra SafeChem? Let's start with that. It's a 4+4 year research program targeting green and sustainable chemistry with a holistic approach to chemicals. By working on new synthesis processes, tools for improved risk assessment and life cycle management, the scientists hope to predict and avoid risks already in the design phase. We have had 3 webinars in this series about the research in the program. This is the 4th one. And one more is to come. You can see the recordings from the others by registering on our website. And I do encourage you to go into our website, mistrasafechem.se, and register for the newsletter to ensure that you don't miss out any information from the program. The Mistra SafeChem program has a vision, and that is to enable and promote the expansion of a safe, sustainable and green chemical industry in Sweden. So, safe, sustainable and green, we believe that life cycle thinking is key. Our research in Mistra SafeChem strives towards an operational life cycle-based toolbox. But what is safe and sustainable then? Work is ongoing to define criteria for safe and sustainable by design. And the EU Green Deal includes a new approach towards zero pollution. Chemicals and materials should deliver function without environmental and ecological boundaries being exceeded, taking the entire life cycle into consideration. Safety and sustainability need to be considered in design, redesign, and alternatives assessment. This is a challenge, and practical guidance and operational tools are needed. The Mistra SafeChem life cycle-based chemicals assessment toolbox is well aligned with the current chemical strategy in the EU. The toolbox contains tools for chemicals alternatives assessment, chemical footprint assessment, and life cycle assessment. The main tools for ecotoxicity and toxicity impact assessment are UseTox and ProScale, and you will hear more about these in a little bit. And based on experiences in a wide variety of case studies, the tools are further advanced and a practical guide is being developed. So let's look into this research. First out is Thomas Rydberg. Please go ahead, Thomas.
Thomas, vi ser inte dig.
The core tools for chemical footprint, use tox and pro scale. So let's go on here. So Hanna mentioned we are in Mistra SafeChem dealing with life cycle approaches to chemicals management. And most of you present here are probably a bit familiar at least with life cycle assessment. So you know that we look at the system from raw material to end of life. And all the processes involved in that. And from such an assessment, we collect all the inputs and outputs, and they are several. Now, the assessment of human toxicity impacts and also ecotoxicity impacts have until now been a bit let's say certain, or a bit more complicated and not so often applied as, for example, global warming potential assessments for reasons of data scarcity and also complexity of the matter. So that's a couple of areas where we are focusing specifically in Mistra SafeChem to make this more easily available to the practitioner. So going straight into the assessment approaches that we apply. First, a bit of a general description of the exposure effect assessment that's at stake when we look at the chemicals in life cycle assessment. All methods available, and there are several of them, work in principally the same manner. We have an exposure part and a hazard or effect assessment part, and they are combined in various ways to form an impact factor or a characterization factor, you might call it. And of course, on top, we need to collect a lot of data in order to do these assessments. And the different methods are different in the sense that they require different amounts of data from other sources. So we are predominantly working with two approaches in Mistra SafeChem, the use tox method and the pro scale method. And let's take a short look of the exposure models and the scope of those here. So the worker exposure coming out from this production system is of course one of the key areas, and the other one is the environmental and population exposure, like you see here, and it all relates of course to the same value chain as shown in this slide here. I won't go into the value chain per se, but of course it branches out typically much more than this if we want to address the inputs and outputs in all processes relative to a certain product X that is necessary for a service of a product or to provide the service of a product essentially. So the pro scale method is predominantly looking at worker exposure, but also the service life exposure of inhabitants when that's relevant. So it's in the current version 1.5 looking specifically at this kind of exposure scenario, whereas the currently broadly available version of use tox 2.1 covers the environmental and population exposure related to the emissions. So in that sense, these methods are complementary, but both of them are obviously under further development, and it means that the later or version 3 of use tox is also capable of covering the direct exposure related impacts, and similarly the pro scale E for environment version is capable or would be capable of covering the environmental exposure and the effects on the environment. Without going into details, I can just mention that use tox exposure model in the current version 2.1 covers the again, environmental exposure, and also the human toxicity via the environment, whereas the USTOX3 has a coupled near field and far field exposure model, so you can also capture the direct exposure related impacts, as I mentioned. The Pro scale is not as nice a picture maybe, but it shows a little bit further how the assessment of the workplace exposure is dealt with in that model. It's very much built, or in fact it is built on the EasyTalk tiered risk assessment, EasyTalk TRA version 3, and this picture is taken from that specific report from there. So let's go rather into the effect models. You saw this in the previous slide with the exposure model in USTOX 2.1, but it's then complementing this with the effect model where you look at the concentration response or the dose response, whether it's a environmental or human effect that you want to capture. And you look at the concentration response slope factor. Typically you base it on an ED50 for humans or an EC50 for 3 trophic levels for the environmental assessment. The Pro scale is slightly differently designed because it's based on the hazard classification in REACH and in other harmonized systems for chemicals classification and labeling. And each substance is then assigned into a Pro scale hazard class, which defines the bandwidth in which you will define the effect factor. The effect factor is then further modified or fine-tuned with the help of occupational exposure limit values for various substances. Or it could also be a DNL, which is the derived no effect limit as defined in the REACH regulation. So this leads to certain differences in the various, let's say, outcome of these effect factors. So relating to the effect models in the two systems, as you can see in this slide. And it's not so much to, let's say, think is very peculiar, because you can just see that there is a trend that if they were exactly identical in the two models, there would be a straight line of dots from the origo point and going up to the upper right corner. But now, as you see, there is a certain distribution of dots in the graph, so it indicates that there is a difference between the two models. And we're looking further into that in the research program. And just to show you a little bit the outcome of a study where we have looked at both the Pro scale and the USTOX method applied to the same product system. This particular study was not carried out within Mistra SafeChem, but it's an illustrative example nevertheless. And basically what you see here is the outcome for the system on the left hand of the picture for the Pro scale and USTOX methods applied to inhalation and dermal exposure for Pro scale, and for the two categories cancer and non-cancer impacts on humans via the environment for USTOX. And also for illustration, we've included the climate change in the middle. Yes, the middle bar here. So the outcome here is essentially that we have a different outcome. So there are different, let's say, segments of the product life cycle that will be highlighted as the key aspect, and that key aspect will be different for the different methods. So it indicates again, or also in the results, that it's a good way to, or a good thing to include both approaches, because then you will capture other key aspects that you wouldn't capture if you left it out. So that's the key message of that method. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you ever so much, Thomas, for that brilliant presentation. I cannot see any need for clarifications in the chat. So with that, I just give the word to Kerstin to give her presentation. Please go ahead.
Yes. Oh. You can hear me, right? Sorry, I was a little bit confused. It didn't show me that I am hearable now. Yes, so thank you, Hannah, for handing over the word to me. So welcome to my presentation. I want to talk to you about leveraging digital methods to tackle chemical assessment challenges, which surrounds around my PhD project I'm doing at the DTU. So first off, we saw that we have these nice tools, UseTox and ProScale, to make an assessment of chemicals. But if we look at the current market or the current state of how many chemicals do we have out there in the world, we can see that there's a little bit of a gap. So to put some numbers on this, we have a recent review by Wang et al. From 2020, who identified all the chemicals that have been registered for use and production worldwide in different systems and different countries. And they identified 350,000 different chemicals that are actually being used and produced in a relevant capacity or volume. And if we compare this number to the amount of chemicals we have, for example, in UseTox, which is just about 3,000, we can see that there is quite a big gap, and we need to have much more information on all the other 349,000 chemicals that we are not really, at least don't have readily available the information that we want to look at. And at the same time, of course, we are looking here at only the big volume chemicals that actually have to be registered. And the real number of chemicals is likely to be more in the millions. And of course, coming back to Hannah's point of safe and sustainable development by design, we can see that most likely we will have to even assess a bunch of chemicals that might never make it to the market for R&D purposes to really find the most sustainable alternative. So taking this into account and also looking at the production trend that we can see that roughly every 20 years, we can expect a doubling of the global chemical production capacity. And this has been this way from 2000 to 2017. And it is also expected to double again by 2030 compared to 2017 levels. So taking all of this into account, we actually saw just in the beginning of this year, a publication by a group of scientists that have declared that the planetary boundary for novel entities had been breached. So the novel entities does account for both traditional chemical pollution, but also other more novel chemical-like compounds like plastics or nanomaterials. And what I found interesting in their research was that the main reason they gave for stating that the planetary boundary had been breached is that they defined the safe operating space as the space where basically our capacity for assessment and monitoring of the chemicals can keep up with the annual production and release of these chemicals. And this is currently not the case. So basically, we have so many chemicals and we're releasing and producing them, but we are not able to assess them properly and therefore make sure that we are safe and sustainable in the way that we are handling and using chemicals. And so to look a little bit more into detail on this side, what are the main reasons why can our chemical assessment not really keep up with the production? So first of all, we saw already in the presentation also for the toxicity tools by Thomas that there is a huge need for data, and we have to characterize not only the chemicals themselves, but also the products and applications that they are used in and the processes that are needed to produce these chemicals. And every one that has ever tried to make a life cycle assessment knows that the most tedious part of this work is really to try and find any kind of data that is usable. And if there is no data, you have to try to go and find a proxy. And this is really such a time-consuming task. And really comes also with the high complexity, because you really don't want to have a tunnel view on just a small part of the life cycle or one single impact category, but you want to have the complete view of all the possible impacts and the entire life cycle. So clearly, a good opportunity here would be to have digital methods that can predict the information that you want. But then again, most LCA practitioners will be challenged by the fact that it's very difficult to interpret these predicted values and make sure that they are compatible with the other measure data that you're using. So Mistra SafeChem has decided to try and address some of these challenges by implementing the PhD project, which I have the pleasure to work on, with the wonderful title Advancing Life Cycle-Based Chemical Toxicity Characterization Through Digitalization. And this PhD project has three main objectives. The first one is to map digital methods to identified gaps in the life cycle toxicity characterization approaches that we have available. In the second objective, the focus is actually a little wider, so it's not only toxicity, but here we are looking into trying to define some decision rules depending on the function of the chemical in its application context to really decide, so depending on how this chemical is used, what is the most important impact that I have to look at in order to make a robust screening of the chemical effects before trying to make further developments or narrowing down, for example, on a smaller group of chemical alternatives. And then finally, the third objective is, of course, to develop and test some of these digital methods to predict, for example, chemical-related data or exposure patterns and toxicity effects in some of the dedicated industry case studies that we have in the Mistra SafeChem program, and then derive some broader guidance on how we can apply and really combine also the use of digital methods with the existing methodology. So currently I'm focusing my work on the first objective, and I wanted to take you a little bit more into detail what I'm working on there. So a little bit on the scope, we are looking into gaps in life cycle toxicity characterization. So basically considering these common tools that are available, such as ProScale and UseTox. And we really want to cover all the different life cycle stages, covering extraction, manufacturing, use, and end of life. And considering the releases, therefore, not only from the process emissions, but also from the product applications. Then, of course, there will be the released chemicals will behave in the environment in a certain way and distribute in the outdoor or indoor environment. And finally, via different exposure rates, reach to the ecosystem or the human and cause a certain effect. So what we consider as gaps in this context is really all the parameters that are required to describe the behavior of a chemical along this entire exposure pathway. So the main aim for the mapping is that we want to start off at one of these gaps that we identify and find a systematic approach to reach from the gap site all the way to an implementation of an applicable model. So for the first part of the gap identification, we are currently looking into defining the gaps or the parameters each at the corresponding level at which it is needed for the application in the model. And then we are also looking into different sensitivities of the parameter. This is, of course, very important, first of all, to just see if this is a very important gap to look at, but also to have a better understanding of how accurate do I need to have a prediction, how impactful is it on the final result that I will get from the model, the characterization. And the third thing we're also looking into is to screen for commonly available data sources and repositories to get a good understanding of what is the good starting point. If I want to build a data-based model, such as a machine learning model, what is a good starting point to start my analysis? And then the next thing we are doing is really to provide some guidance and some systematic way of taking decisions and considerations along the following pathway to developing a model. So I've outlined a few of the important considerations that have to be made. For example, if you decided on a gap and have also identified some potential data sources or repositories, you of course have to mine your data set. So you have to really try to curate and enrich the data as much as possible. But at the same time, you also have to consider what is the quality and uncertainty that you can allow in your data set, because clearly, depending on what you put in the model, you get out. So there's this typical principle that says garbage in, garbage out. So you really want to make sure that you have a lot of data, but you also have good quality data. And then the third very important step in the data mining process is that you have to go and select so-called features, which is basically characterizations of certain predictors that make it more easy for an algorithm to work with it. So as an example, you will know that there is chemical structures that can be characterized with molecular descriptors, so that the machine learning algorithm will gain a better intuition about what is the differences between chemicals and how are they similar. So when you have then arrived at this nice data set that is hopefully very big and high quality, you will actually move to the machine learning domain, where you can go on and first of all define your problem type, which is typically either a class prediction or a continuous variable prediction, which is called a regression. And from this, you can then move on to select the algorithms you want to test. And you can also have the potential to combine different algorithms depending on what your initial testing results show you. Then there's a whole fleet of model training and validation steps you have to make. And if you when you finally arrived at a good high-performing model, you will still want to go and define an applicability domain and provide some information on how to interpret the results, so that you can make sure that a user is actually able to use this, first of all, the model only in an area where it's actually producing valid results, and also that the user understands how it can implement the predicted results compared to other measured results. So this is basically the overall broader way of arriving from a gap to the model. And this is, of course, more on the theoretical base. So we are also at the same time looking into a more practical example of this gap to machine learning model workflow. So what we are currently working on is as a test case to predict ecotoxicity effect factors for use tox. And so to basically follow the same line of thoughts, first of all, we have to implement some of our LCA domain knowledge. The effect factor is famous for being a rather high sensitive, having a parameter with very high sensitivity. So it can have a high potential to really impact and direct the ultimate impact factor that we get out for a chemical. So this is also the reason why we chose to start with this parameter. And then we have to look into the parameter definitions. So for the use tox ecotoxicity effect factor, the most useful input here is actually the HC20 value. So to explain a little what is an HC20 value, some of you might be more familiar with the concept of effect concentration. So the effect concentration, if we take the EC10 as an example, is the concentration at which 10% of one species shows a response or an effect. And if we now move to the HC20 value, we will want to take the level where 20% of all the species are exposed above their EC10 value. So this is actually not specifically one toxicity value to a certain species for a certain chemical, but more a chemical property for the entire ecosystem. So in order to predict this parameter, we have found our data set, which is already curated through the Solutions project. And this data set contains 250,000 different effect concentrations and covers a total of more than 12,000 chemicals. And it also contains not only aquatic species, but also some terrestrial and at different endpoints and also different exposure settings. So for those of you that have listened carefully, you might notice that actually this data set contains the effect concentrations at the species level, and we are ultimately interested in this HC20 level, which is across species. And this gives us some interesting ways of setting up our data set in different ways. So we are currently playing around with that, and I'm very excited how this will turn out. But this will also ultimately affect on how we can select some more features, some more of these predictors, not only for the chemical, but potentially also for species or species groups. So, and when we have then finally arrived at our data set, which we are currently working on, then we will go on and try to apply some of the machine learning algorithms. Generally, this is a regression problem, so we are trying to predict a continuous value here. And so our current scope is to really try and select some of the most popular algorithms, such as support vector machines or random forests and neural networks, and test these and try to see how they perform against each other. And then ultimately, we will select the best performing model and apply it to predict for as many chemicals as possible these HC20 value in order to arrive the ecotoxicity effect factors. Yes, so many interesting things to come. I hope you're excited as me, and I encourage you to follow my research, of course. And yes, so this was the end of my presentation, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Kerstin, for such a brilliant presentation. It was clear and easy to follow, even though the topic is highly advanced. I see no need for clarifications in the chat. There are starting to come in questions, but these we will take later. So thank you, Kerstin, and it is time for Jutta. Please go ahead, Jutta.
This will be fine. There you go. So last part, and difficult to follow up after Kerstin. The way forward, we want to use this information together with other information on life cycle impacts in a chemical footprint and then ultimately also in an LCA. And that, of course, poses more challenges, and I guess you can imagine already some of them from Kerstin's and Thomas' presentations. Just a reminder, our Mistra SafeChem program, we have an approach, and this approach is illustrated here, which we use in MSc. It's a set of focus areas and actions that are proposed to be investigated intended to implement safe and sustainable practices, and we need to evaluate also all the time whether we succeed with that. And it was always, as a key element, proposed to use a life cycle perspective and to apply this holistic assessment from cradle to grave and avoid shifting of burden along the life cycle and between different media and endpoints. That's basically the largest advantage that you could say about life cycle assessment. So we want to make use of that. Next one, I think I can go around a bit faster because many of you have already background in life cycle assessment, and Thomas has already also indicated how it works. It is standardized, so there are two standards, and one is more principles and framework, and the other one is a bit more in detail. We look into life cycles from raw material extraction to the final deposition and everything in between, manufacturing, packaging, use, and also recycling steps. So there's a new dimension coming also with a lot of circular economy measures that are now used. It's well established since 50 years, and the standards are around since about more than 20 years. Yeah, this is our framework that we're going to use in the life cycle assessment, and we have used it in the toolbox that Hannah already also mentioned. So we have a complementary assessment of alternative solutions. We have key criteria to identify and develop safe and sustainable alternatives are applied on different levels. So we have the chemical alternatives assessment, we have the chemical footprint assessment, and we have the life cycle assessment on the middle to right part of the slide. And if you wish to extract what are the different areas, you can say that they are focusing different levels and details of information. The assessment of alternative solutions has to focus on substituting hazardous chemicals in a specific product or process application. So it's set very much and a bit more focused and a limited system, but a high level of detail. And the chemical footprint assessment is somewhere in a middle layer where we focus on assessing toxicity and ecotoxicity profiles and process. But this information will then be needed in a life cycle assessment where you focus on a very large system and try to catch all relevant environmental impacts of products and process systems. So these are different contexts and different situations, and we work on all three of them. Traditionally, an LCA has the holistic perspective from cradle to grave, I mentioned that, and environmental impacts can be observed at all stages from raw material extraction to disposal, and all of them should be included quantitatively in the LCA. That's a key feature. And this is a bit of a challenge, of course, when you put it then together with a more focused assessment type, such as the alternatives assessment, We have impact assessment to consider different aggregated areas of protection. And in general, it's human health, biodiversity, and resource availability. And we have a long-term perspective. We want to understand the range of different impact categories in a holistic context and provide results beyond isolated footprints. This is really pure LCA, or this is a huge benefit of LCA. And we have to overcome some of this, or we have to challenge some of these very key features of LCA in order to make the information that we extract from chemical footprints valuable. Just yesterday, if you listen live, and otherwise you will find out that it was on the 22nd of March, there was a workshop where EU presented the chemical strategy for sustainability, and in particular the framework to define safe and sustainable by design. This is an ongoing big project or big activity that will have impact on us also. And just to give you some cliff notes from yesterday, if you haven't listened in, the idea is to follow a 5-step sustainability assessment. The first step is to assess the safety of chemicals and materials based on a hazard-based approach. And this is one step in the entire system that will deliver a cutoff. So systems or chemicals and materials that are not identified as safe and sustainable by design in this stage can be excluded from further assessment unless it is found out that they are required for an essential use. Then they will still go to the rest of the assessment. Next step is the chemical or material processing safety and considering occupational safety and health aspects. Then comes the human health and environmental impacts for the direct exposure. Here safety levels are defined, and the safety levels are basically also taken from the first step where they were added for those substances or chemicals and materials that are considered to be safe and sustainable by design and are taken further. Then comes the environmental sustainability assessment, and to do that, an LCA is suggested. So an LCA is here done in the context of a larger assessment, and it's only the 4th step. And the LCA is introducing environmental targets. This will be a bit more important in the following slides also. The 5th step is not yet defined, as I understood it. At least it's gray in all the publications. So they are still working on it, and they will find out how they're going to approach that one. I already said step 1 can be the cutoff step to identify non-SSBD chemicals and materials and reject them from further processing. Step 3 and step 4 have as a common feature that chemicals and materials can actually fail here. So if they score too high compared to safety levels, and they identified that this is not a safe chemical for consumer use in regard of direct exposure, they can be rejected and taken away or defined as non-SSBD maybe again. And safety and chemicals and materials can also fail on the level 4. So here we have environmental targets, and if the chemicals are found to exceed environmental targets, for instance, as Kerstin said, they are exceeding the capacity in regards to the planetary boundaries, they can also be singled out here. This will be an interesting development, and it was met with some surprise, I can say, yesterday. I've heard that from many participants. The approach to define targets in an LCA that the EU suggests is not new, but it's not really established in the ISO standards, and it's using normalization and weighting. These both are not considered the mandatory part in the ISO standards for the impact assessment, and it's even said that they should be avoided in publicly available comparative assessment assertions. It's not should be avoided, they have to be avoided. You cannot do that if you want to publish the results and say that you worked according to ISO. But the product environmental footprint category rules, that's another EU initiative, and this SSBD framework both encourage doing normalization and weighting. So this is a new paradigm for LCA practitioners. We have to understand how this should work and how we can make use of it. And the aim of using normalization and weighting is to identify which are the most relevant impact categories, which are the most relevant life cycle stages and process, and to define the targets. Therefore, they are needed and therefore they are suggested. Normalization is based on global normalization factors. They can be expressed as total and per person. And this can be, as a first step, used to provide a dimensionless result for each impact category or a result per capita. The weighting factors in the PEF draft exclude toxicity-related impact categories as of yet, and there are some categories suggested or some weighting factors suggested that even include toxicity-related impacts, but they are more in informative annex, so they are not used in the weighting factors that are suggested. Why do we need this type of further investigation? Impact assessments are done to concentrate the information from hundreds and thousands of flows that you get from a life cycle inventory, and to put that together in a limited number of impact categories. And the impact categories that are suggested in the PEF and in SSBD are in total 16. These are the recommended categories. The intention is basically, as I said, to condense information in the impact assessment, and 16 impact categories are then again probably a bit too much to take in. So further processing steps are needed, and the normalization and weighting are seen as the further processing steps to condense the information further. You can see the list. I hope you can read them. It's a bit small maybe on your screen. And what I also want to highlight is that on the right side, there's a robustness indicator. It has levels from 1 to 3. And if for all models that are seen as 1, the model is considered to be recommended and satisfactory, whereas for models that are have a robustness of 3, the model is recommended, but to be applied with caution. It is singled out a bit the toxicity assessment. So for human toxicity with cancer and non-cancer effect, and for ecotoxicity, they are considered to be have a robustness of 3, and they are even labeled as interim. And all the toxicity categories have a bit of an asterisk, or they have an asterisk after their name. So they are still singled out, and there's a lot of work to do. We hope that casting can contribute here a lot, and we all can contribute here a lot. The weighting step is the next step that is suggested in the PEF pilots and in the PEF category rules, and also in the SSBD. And this is maybe a step too far at the moment for the LCA community, because now comes the value choices. It's the quantitative weighting factors that are suggested based on feedback from experts and general public. The EU has done some surveys and published the results in 2018, and they try to motivate weighting factors based on the dimensions: geography, time, physical, chemical properties, the magnitude. So here you can again see the level of impact compared to planetary boundaries and the intensity. But the reaction to the suggested weighting factors as of yet is quite reluctant, I would say. So we'll see how they will be applied. They have obviously their advantage, and they have their merit in bringing together the results in an overall assessment. But we will try them out, and we'll see how we can use them. I would say it was at least received with surprise and not a bit reluctance. We want to use our Mistra SafeChem program to investigate some case studies and support the development of the life cycle-based chemicals assessment toolbox. So we're going to use some of the tools that I've described now. I'm going also to use more of the tools that Thomas and Kerstin have described in details, and we try to put them all together in this life cycle-based toolbox. We have if you remember my starting slides, this is again the key elements in the Mistra SafeChem, and we populate this life cycle based assessment toolbox by using case studies. We have covered all of the key elements, renewable carbon feedstocks to design for safety and sustainability, and that's how we're going to work. One more slide to summarize. We will develop the toolbox based on case study activities and provide more data and data acquisition techniques. Kerstin's PhD is an important contribution here. We will have a strong focus on digitalization and high throughput modeling to provide more data, as data gaps are seen as a very valid barrier at the moment. And then we will help you and us with the guidance and illustration of the toolbox as a contribution to support the holistic assessment and make this available during the project and during our work in the program. We want to support the identification of the most relevant impact categories, life cycle stages and processes. This is in line with the safe and sustainable by design process, where we also contribute with our work. And yeah, this is what we do, and it's an exciting and interesting program, and it's really nice to be part of this. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jutta, for a very good presentation, wrapping it all up and clearly describing a way forward as we see it in Mistra SafeChem. So now it is time for the Q&A session. And I'm very happy to see that we have quite a few questions already. I'm going to try and find them here in Teams. So are you all ready? We start from the beginning, I think. And I will publish them as we go along so that you can see them as well. So this is a question to Thomas. Are there any substantial differences in implementation of UseTox and ProScale in different LCA tools, corresponding to how AVER is implemented in Gabi and CIMAPRO when using EcoInvent data?
Oh, okay. How much time do I have?
You have a couple of minutes, and then
Okay.
if you like, we can,
Yeah.
we can address it again in another outreach.
So UseTox 2.1 is implemented in the regular software. ProScale is not implemented. So we are developing something that you could refer to as an add-on database that needs to be then used in, you could say, in parallel, but you would have to do some tricks if you're an LCA practitioner to get it into your assessment. I guess that's the short answer.
Okay, thank you ever so much. And I can just tell everybody that if we don't have the time to answer all the questions, we will give you a written response after the webinar. So do keep asking questions. We have a question here from an anonymous person, and I think this is for Jutta. Do you consider that chemical footprint is sufficiently addressed in the current developed EU product environmental footprint?
Well, it is part of the 16 impact categories that are suggested, and therefore it will go in with the as part of the toxicity assessment. There is still room for development, and as you can see from the asterisks, even those who propose this method see that there's still room for development. So it is, all the toxicity categories are seen as interim, and there will be more work to be done. So the answer in short could be not yet, but we see a way forward to consider it further.
Thank you very much for that answer. So see what we have next. There is a question to Kerstin. The predicting model that you showed seems to be focused on prediction of a characterization factor. Are you also planning to predict life cycle inventory for the manufacturing of a chemical?
Yes, thanks for the question. So generally, I would say that the LCI is also included in the general scope of the project. Of course, we cannot foresee yet exactly what I will work on, but overall, I would expect that the life cycle inventory side will for sure be playing a bigger role when it comes to deriving the decision rules for which impact categories to consider. So yes, I hope I will also have time to work on this side.
Thank you, Kerstin. And then we have a question that I will start giving to Thomas, and then I expect that maybe Jutta want to add to this. So Thomas, what is your position on the safe and sustainable by design approach to hazard? What is your position on the safe and sustainable by design approach to hazard-based approach, step 1? And is it contradictory to then apply risk-based approach in step 2 and 3? So is it a contradiction that we first start by hazard assessment and then continue with the risk assessment?
Wow, another of my favorite questions. Thank you for posing that one. Yes, indeed, step 1 is hazard based, and just like Jutta, I was also listening in on the webinar yesterday, and there is an ongoing discussion, and I should probably also say that the current proposal from JRC is in fact a proposal or a draft. So there will be a lot of discussion going on over the next, I don't know, year at least, how this is going to be designed. My personal preference as a scientist would probably be to have more of a multi-criteria approach where you optimize all at once, and so therefore more of a risk-based approach also in step 1. But I can also see the point in probably it's more practical to implement more of this hierarchical approach where you have some cutoff criteria in step 1. So I'm a bit, how do you say, ambiguous here to what I would actually say to this. But I mean, there is, as an LCA practitioner for the past decades, I also know that there are examples where you can sub-optimize if you make a cut-off criteria in a certain early stage of development. So of course there is a certain risk that you might cut off some promising final solutions because you ruled them out in an early stage based on a cut-off criteria that's too narrow. So I think there is a fine balance to be found there, how to deal with that. And I'm not sure how this is going to play out, of course, in the end, but this is so far I've been thinking about it until now.
Thank you, Thomas. Jutta, do you want to add anything to this?
The only thing that I can add is that when listening in yesterday, just as Thomas said, my takeaway was also that many people said this is a paradigm shift. So it is has a huge impact on how we work, and this is not the final version. That was also one of the conclusions that the presenters came up with, that there is still a lot of work to do in the SSBD framework.
Okay, thank you.
But
so
I can add
yeah?
may I add one more thing? I think there was also a bit of a discussion around the fact, and I agree to that the current suggestion is very much based on what we already do in the safety of chemicals world and what we already do in the environmental or sustainability assessment of products, and they are sort of put together. And this means that there are certain inconsistencies between the two sides, and there are some gaps in the middle. And there is also not necessarily the element of by design so visible in there. It's more like by assessment, if you understand what I mean by now. So I think the work that Kerstin is doing here will be a very important contribution also in this aspect. And what we do in other work packages in Mistra SafeChem, where we work a lot with predictive computational methods to predict properties of chemicals, and I think that will be an extremely important way forward as well in the context of the SSBD, because of course in design phase of things you're in an early conceptual phase where you don't have necessarily chemicals available to do something, but of course trying then to come up with reasonable predictions of properties, including toxicity and ecotoxicity effect of certain chemicals, will be very useful in safe and sustainable by design approach, one way or the other. So thank you for allowing me to say this.
Very good. The next question connects nicely to this, and it is for you, Kerstin. And it's a question: will you also map models predicting persistency and biodegradability, or do you focus on toxicity?
Yes, so generally the scope is again all of the chemical parameters or other parameters that are related to characterizing the chemicals. So this also includes biodegradation, bioaccumulation, partitioning in the environment. So not only the ultimate effect side, but we have not decided yet what we will work on, and it will also depend on the result of the mapping that I'm currently making, where we are trying to get a little bit of a ballpark of how much data is out there. Because of course, if you want to go and apply machine learning tools, you need a good quality and optimally a large data set, especially when you want to predict complex properties that can vary a lot among chemicals. So yes, I might work on it, but I cannot promise it yet.
Thank you, Kerstin. We have one more question from the audience, and that is to Jutta. So Jutta, is the EU implementation of sustainable chemicals indicated to be through Sustainable Products Initiative or REACH, or also other legislative means?
Right, that's it's a difficult question for me because I'm not part of the process. I understand that this is the idea with this SSBD and the current initiatives are to bridge the gaps between the silos that we have with the chemicals assessment in REACH and product assessment and product development that's more in the LCA sphere. So I think they want to bring this together in a better way, but that's my guess. It's my personal guess. So I'm not aware that there are any additional approaches to provide legislative means. And my impression from yesterday was also that they see this as the first contact with the general audience, and they go back to the drawing board and they will work on this further. But it's of course there's a lot of information out there collected via REACH and via chemicals legislation that is absolutely useful for product design, and this will be made available in a better way. I think that's what I could say from my observation at the moment. Maybe Thomas can add here, but
if you have something very quick, Thomas, you can add, and otherwise it's time for us to wrap up.
Okay. I agree with, let's say that there was a discussion how to combine these silos, and it's not an easy task, and whether this, let's say, which of the initiatives will win in the end is very hard to predict, I would say. But I think Sustainable Products Initiative is important in this context because it takes a broader picture of products, and of course chemicals are included in products. So in that sense, it's also necessary to combine the approaches one way or the other. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all presenters for timing your talks so nicely, and thank you for the audience for giving really interesting questions. It is now time to wrap this up, and I see if I can find, here we go. I just want to give you some final information. So we mentioned in the introduction that we have had breakfast webinars before. So they are on green and sustainable chemistry, hazard and risk screening, catalysis to materials, and they are all recorded. So you can see them on our website if you register. So please go visit our website. And I also mentioned that we have a final one for this series coming up, and that is on case studies on cosmetics, air quality inside cars and other. And it's in May 24th. So do visit the website and register for this webinar as well. So with that, we would all like to thank you for listening in and giving really interesting questions. And we hope to see you again, and we hope that you follow our research. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you, everybody.